Right, good evening. I want to dedicate tonight's shiur in memory of Iris Blank, who passed away this morning. Judith Esther Batfaivush. It was an absolute shock. She had been in the hospital. I mentioned last week she was having an operation. She had the operation, there was problems, and whatever, Hashem's hands, and she passed away this morning. It was this afternoon. So Neshama should have an aliyah, and we learned in her memory. So we're going to do two things now. As I mentioned in the message earlier this morning, I'm going to spend a little bit more time on Ben Gurion for a few minutes, and then we're going to segue into something Ben Gurion began, and it takes us into World War II. I don't usually like taking things completely, out of our timeline because we're really still in the early 1900s. But it's important to understand that the path that this Jewish brigade takes, which becomes part of his mark of Jewish history. And we'll get to that in a little bit. So we're still at the point now, we're talking about Ben Gurion's interactions with the Arabs. The interaction with the Arabs becomes a very important point because we also talked last week about the declaration, not the declaration. It'll come to me in a second. My mind just went blank. About the coexistence of the Jews with the Balfour Declaration. I don't know how I can forget that. In his earlier years, he actually thought the Jews could somehow coexist with the Arabs. And as time went on, he would see, and he even thought the Arabs worked together with Jewish workers in a common struggle. It became pretty obvious to him that by the 1930s, he was very unrealistic in that idea and didn't even realize the depth of the Arab opposition to what seemed to be a speeding train heading towards statehood. Arabs saw Zionism, and rightfully so, as a threat to their own national aspirations. Matter of fact, Ben Gurion wrote privately that if he were an Arab, chas v'shalom, I don't mean chas v'shalom to be an Arab. If he were an Arab, we wouldn't have Ben Gurion. If he were an Arab, he would also have opposed the Zionist movement. It did not lead him to abandon the Zionist dream just because of that, obviously, because in his mind, the one thing that was absolutely non-negotiable was a homeland for the Jewish people. That was non-negotiable. How it was to be run, how was the government going to look? Was it going to be a socialist government? Was it going to be a Israeli type of a government? At that point, it wasn't as important to him as having, as I say, boots on the ground, their own state. As the rise of anti-Semitism continues to grow in Europe, I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about then. It's worse today. The urgency becomes even more and more clear. Problem becomes that the British, who, remember, this is now after World War I, and it's still called the British Mandate. It's called Mandatory Palestine. And the British have taken the land from the Turks, and they are running the show. They decide in their true chesed, they want to show the Jews that they're going to restrict Jewish immigration. It's no secret that the British government was much more favoring the Arabs than the Jews. One great example, and I didn't mention it last week because I wanted to wait till this week, because we talked last week about the Hebron massacre. And that took place in 1929. And during that massacre, it was very clear that the Arabs were killing Jews. The British, the police, nobody intervened. And at some point, after X amount of day, I think a day and a half later, I don't remember what kind of an officer came into Hebron on his horse, shot literally one bullet in the air, and that was it. He could have done that on Friday night when the massacre was going on. They waited. In any case, what the British did, they restricted Jewish immigration. It was what was called the White Paper of 1939. It restricted Jewish immigration to Israel to 75,000 people over the course of 5 years, not 75,000 a year, 75,000 over the course of 5 years. And Ben Gurion, of course, saw that as complete betrayal. And the crazy thing, when you think about it, is that this white paper comes out in 1939, exactly the same time as Hitler is preparing what becomes, as he calls, the final solution. The Hitler's invading Poland September 1st, 1939, which we'll get to. So it's this confluence of, okay, the Jews, things are going to get really bad for you right now in Europe. Oh, and by the way, you have nowhere to run. We're not even sure we close the doors. We're going to open up a little crack. Maybe a few you can come in a year, but we don't want to have too many of you guys. So during World War II, Ben Gurion has a very complex situation to deal with. Does he fight, he meaning him along with the Jewish people, alongside the British against Hitler, because they have a common enemy? It's not even a, or if. It's that has to happen. At the same time, he has to oppose British policing Palestine, because he wants to see this as becoming as a Jewish state. He wants to become eventually the land of Israel. Thousands of Jews volunteer for the British Army, and they serve in North Africa, Italy, and other places. And the Jewish Brigade, as it becomes known, fights under its own flag. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video about the British Brigade, and then we're going to kind of jump ahead in history to talk about this fascinating, but sometimes just gets mentioned as a footnote, but was really a huge, important step, not only in the eventual founding of the State of Israel, but eventually the IDF, Tzahal. So let me just get the screen share set up here. And remember to share sound. And let me find it. This share. Make this large. Take this off. So we're going to talk now about this, the background to this, how it didn't just one day, all of a sudden, thousands of Jews are fighting along the British to fight the Arabs. It didn't happen. So nothing comes easily. Again, we have to reestablish certain facts. It's mandatory power, i.e. the British are in charge and becoming increasingly hostile to the Zionist movement. The 1939 white paper basically slammed the door shut almost on immigration. And when the Jews needed a refuge more than ever. On the other hand, Nazi Germany didn't just represent a threat to the Jewish people. It represented an existential threat to Jews, and by extension, an existential threat to a lot of other people in the world, especially in Eastern Europe and Russia, and eventually would have been Canada, the United States, if you know a little bit about what was going on. The Jews looked at this as a milchemet mitzvah, a war that is a fight for Jewish survival. Which war? We're talking about the war against the Nazis. Just like
I don't know if there was a movie made about the Jewish Brigade.
Correct. I was going to find it and send a link out to that. Thank you, Danny.
Called In Our Own Hands, the hidden story of the Jewish Brigade in World War II.
Right. Very good. So if you remind me afterwards, I'll send out a link if it's available on YouTube. Thank you. So the milchemet mitzvah, sometimes it's hard to understand what that means. Literally means a milchama, a war, that is a mitzvah to engage in, which we have been in since October 7th of 2023. We are the collective we, sighed a humongous sigh of relief yesterday with the last hostage being brought tomorrow to burial, to Jewish burial, which is unbelievable. Baruch Hashem. We have to say, Hodu Hashem Ki Tov. But the Milchemet Mitzvah, the war we were in then for fight for Jewish survival, as we were today, is the same kind of idea that was going on then. Ben Gurion is faced with these two opposing ideas. We got the British breathing down our neck, and yet we have to fight with the British against the Nazis. And he made a statement that became extremely famous. You probably, I shouldn't say probably, you may have heard this. I have the quote here. We shall fight the war as if there's no white paper, and we will fight the white paper as if there were no war, which means he has to straddle both sides of this. And the truth is that there were thousands of Jews, as I mentioned earlier, that went to volunteer to serve in the British Army, even before Britain agreed to have any distinct Jewish fighting unit, meaning Jews started to fight, but they weren't fighting under the Jewish flag, so to speak. So what happened with the enlistment? So approximately 30 to 35,000 Jews in mandatory Palestine served in British uniform during World War II. They were a huge percentage, 30 to 35,000 people in today's numbers. When you're talking Baruch Hashem B'li Ayin Hara, millions of Jews living in Israel is a small amount. But when you're talking about pre-state Israel, there's less than 500,000. 35,000 is a huge percent of the Yeshuv's adult male population. The volunteers included farmers, laborers, yeshiva students, professionals, recent refugees. Did I mention yeshiva students and also guys learning Kollel? They went out to fight. If I forgot to mention, I'll mention it again. Initially, and I would say with good reason, if I look at it from the British perspective, they're very hesitant to have any kind of distinct Jewish combat unit. And because there is absolutely nothing that repeats that's not happened sometime in history. Let me read you a pasuk. Get it on the screen, just a minute, on my screen, not yours. And I can quote it, but I still like to look at it inside. Shemot, Perek Aleph. Okay. This we read 2 weeks ago. This week the Shal Sabo, 3 weeks ago. Beginning of Sefer Shemot. Let me put it on the screen, actually. Why not? Starting from right here. Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim, asher lo yadat Yosef. A new king arose in Egypt who did not know Yosef, whatever that means right now, whether it was a new king or just his new gzerot. Vayomer elamo, listen to the words here, the next couple of psukim. And he said to his people, Hine am b'nei Yisrael rav ve'atzum mimenu. There's a lot of Jews. Hava nitchakma lo, let's do something clever. Why? Pen yirbeh, maybe some other country's maybe there'll be a war. Some other people are going to come and fight against us. And they're also going to join our enemies and fight against us. And they're going to leave the land. What was Paro's fear? That the Jews were going to join sides and rise up against their enemy, i.e. Paro. What's happening over here? Hit the wrong button. What's happening over here is that the British are concerned that if we hand over not just neshek, not just weaponry to the Jews, but we then send up a separate battalion of the Jews, then maybe they'll turn on us, they'll join the Nazis maybe, and they'll just turn back and kill all of us. So that was one of the things, very much like Paro's mindset, was what they also had in mind when it came to this as well. I want to take a look. I have a couple of notes here that have been sent to me. Let me just take a quick look. Move this over here. Okay, good. Thank you, Danny. You sent me a couple of links. I'll send them out later on then. Wonderful. Toda rabah. So there's this reluctance to give the Jews their own fighting unit. That's first of all. And second of all, they were concerned about multiple layers. Number one, they were worried about angering the Arab population, which it did. There was no question it did that. They were concerned that the Jewish force would become some kind of a nucleus for a future army. It did. And there was this ongoing tension over Zionist goals, political goals. And it did cause that friction and continue that tension. So all their reluctance and the reasons, which are from their perspective very sound, it actually did come to fruition, all their fears. Not that that people rose up and went the British until a little bit later, which we will get to Bezrat Hashem when we talk about that part. So as a result, when they first were, after their first gius or their first enlistment, they were initially dispersed, as the video showed, across various units. And they were also not in combat roles. They were working logistics, they were working transport, they were working in engineering, and others eventually fought in North Africa, Greece, and other places, but still without a Jewish insignia. There was no collective identity. There was nothing identifying them as Jews. The Zionist leadership, on the other hand, got very frustrated with this. What they wanted was soldiers fighting as Jews, not just as individuals, but as a group of Jews. They felt that a visible Jewish contribution to fight and defeat Nazism was critical. It would send a very powerful message to the new Yishuv. It would send a powerful message to the Jews overseas as well. And that military experience, this is the mindset of course, David Ben Gurion. He goes, again, he has the chazon, he has the vision, he's the long-term planner. He knows that there's going to be a state. He felt that this will be the way that will cut their teeth, so to speak, and that the military experience for Jewish defense down the road. So there's, of course, a political struggle. We tend to think sometimes at okay, let's say, for example, the rebellion of Bar Kokhba around the year 131 against the Romans. Okay, they got their people together, boom, they went. There was their plan. They had to lay the groundwork. They had to have food. They had to have weaponry. Same thing here. They had to also have, there was a political engagement as to what happened. So from 1942, there was a lot of pressure to form not just the Jewish Brigade, but to have it a cohesive group under a Jewish, we'll see what that means, under a Jewish flag. It's not the flag of Israel, obviously. Because by 1942, the scope of the Holocaust becomes a little bit clearer. Chaim Weizmann, Ben Gurion, Moshe Sharet, which is a name we haven't talked about yet, we will eventually, and others go to London to lobby for there to be a Jewish unit in the British Army. They argued that the Jews are looking at a national fighting unit of the Poles, the Czechs, the French. They each had their own unit. So why not the Jews? Because again, the Jews are looked at differently than every other people on earth. By 1944, they have a reversal of their policy. And they decide they're going to allow to have the Jews have their own unit under the Jewish tagline. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, the Allied momentum in Europe is speeding up. It reduced the political risk. Now, the gains of the Allies was getting to such a degree that it would not be a, quote, big deal for having a group of Jews that are also fighting alongside the British. The Jewish manpower and motivation was second to none, meaning they may have had a small, relatively speaking to the amount of Poles and other, and not Poles, but others that are fighting. Why not have people who are extremely motivated? Because they're not just fighting a war. They're fighting for a battle of survival. One of the big differences between a war, let's just use modern day Israel, a war that Israel fights in versus a war that, let's say, the United States went to Vietnam or went to Korea, whatever it was, is that the Americans are here, are there in America. I'm saying here, I'm pointing to as if I had a marker. They're here in America, and the war is taking place, 10,000 miles away, whether it's in Korea or taking place in Vietnam. Here, you're going up to the border. You're turning around, you see your house almost from the border, or you're going down south, or you're going to almost every direction. There's another front, and you're fighting for your home front. You're fighting for your family. To the extent, of course, we all know, we've all had this experience where, people in the early days of the war, on Shabbat, they were coming home, and who knew if they were ever going to come back, God forbid. And it's a very different perspective. And that was the similar mindset that the Jews had during this part of history in 1944. They don't know how long the war is going to last. It's not like they have the hindsight of history, because it's the first time there's World War II. So the British felt that motivation would actually be very helpful. They also wanted to reward Jewish loyalty to Allied cause. There was some belief that the Jews deserved some kind of a recognition for the fact that they were fighting now for a couple of years alongside the British, in spite of the fact that the British were not making life so great for Jews in Palestine. In September 1944, officially, Britain authorized the formation of the Jewish Brigade Group. The official name was, to say, the Jewish Brigade Group. It was considered part of the British Eighth Army and was commanded by a man named Brigadier Ernest Benjamin. He was a Canadian-born Jewish officer that served in the British Army. It made up in the beginning, was made up of 5,000 soldiers. Almost all were Jewish volunteers from mandatory Palestine. Now, instead of just being what we would call it's not English, in Hebrew, we call it jobnik. A jobnik is a person who is in the army, in Sahal, who is not a lochem. He's not a person not kravi. He doesn't go out to war. Instead of being kravi, he may help with strategy. It may be in intelligence. It may be in drivers. So many positions. And I don't know if a driver is considered kravi or not, because it depends on where they're driving, I assume. But they're infantry, they're artillery, they're support units. So they're actually doing the fighting as a group. And where do they fly? They fly under a Jewish flag. What kind of Jewish flag? There's no Israel yet. There's no official Israel flag. This is still 4 years before Israel becomes a country. So what they used was a blue and white banner with a Magen David. So it becomes eventually the flag of Israel. But it wasn't exactly, it was similar to this idea of the Jewish flag. And that's what they fought under. They actually, I don't understand. I mean, personally, I don't know why this was done, but they actually had a shoulder patch that said Jewish in Hebrew and English. I guess it was, again, for a sense of pride and camaraderie and everything else. And in the ranks, actually, Hebrew was very, very openly spoken. If you want to hear Hebrew openly spoken, you go to Thailand, I understand. You go to a lot of places in the world now. But these actions were not trivial, just symbolic acts. For the Jewish soldiers, many who had families that were murdered by this point in Europe, this was an assertion of Jewish identity, dignity, agency, national revival. They were deployed as a group, as a unit, to northern Italy in early 1945. And if you know history, you know that it's not that much longer of a war. They entered combat in the final months of the war, and specifically in the Allied offense against the Germans south of the Po River. They engaged, and I'm going to mention a few things that are going to sound like, okay, why am I getting to these details? You'll see in a minute. They engaged in some frontline operations against the Germans. The Jews sustained many casualties. The video showed 700, if I remember right. Many were injured, many were killed, but they performed a very an amazing performance as fighters, and they earned the respect of the Allied commanders. It wasn't ceremonial. It was tachlis. It was tachlis oriented. After Germany surrenders in 1945, the Jewish Brigade still had a lasting impact because they entered, as we saw on the video, they went to survivors in DP camps, displaced person camps. They saw emaciated, traumatized, often sole survivors of entire families that they had to work with. They became the first armed Jewish representatives that the survivors had seen. Remember, keep this in mind. The people that they're encountering had been in the concentration camps for the most part. They had been tortured. There had been horrific things happening. And a Jew would try to raise his hand against a Nazi. It was instant death. And now they come across Jews that were armed to protect them. The emotional effect was immense. The soldiers themselves, of course, wept, cried, and survivors who were seeing strong Jews for the first time, maybe for many, many years, and for the young people in their whole lives, they saw strong Jews, armed Jews, organized Jews. It was amazing. So they went a step further than just helping the DP camps. It was a time period because of what was called bricha. Bricha means to run away. You have nowadays, you have bricha, you have what they call escape rooms. But that's the same, it's the same word. Livroach means to run away. 10 points if you know which parsha has the haftarah Vayivrach Yaakov. So many of the brigade commanders, or members, I should say, become involved in bricha, which is the illegal movement of Jews, illegal not by the Jewish standard, but by the British, They take them from the DP camps of Italy, Austria, Germany. They bring them through the ports. They bring them through mountains onto ships heading towards Palestine in defiance of British white paper. Remember, the British white paper said 75,000 Jews over a 5-year period of time. So it was not officially sanctioned, but it was very widespread. There are many movies, of course, about the whole movement and the illegal ships, and about the Exodus and just legendary. But again, I don't want to get too far into the future, so to speak, because we're going to go back to World War I soon after we do a review. The logistics and protection, brigade vehicles, uniforms, documents, soldiers providing food, forged passports, transportation, protection. It lays the groundwork for another level of aliyah as well. There was one thing that did happen, which was nikama, which was a form of revenge that some of the Jewish brigade veterans, more power to them, actively hunted down former SS officers, Gestapo members, and executed them, took them out. They, in some cases, made it look like an accident. Sometimes make it look just a disappearance. It wasn't the official brigade policy, but it was many times the people looking the other way. The Jews at this time the brigade disbands in 1946. It's only a couple of years now before the establishment of the state of Israel. And because I mentioned to you earlier that I was mentioning about the various things they did, but they were in infantry, they were in logistics, and they were because some of the people that went through the ranks of the Jewish brigade ended up becoming senior commanders in Haganah, the Palmach, and later the IDF. When we talk about eventually about the underground movements, was the Haganah, the Palmach, the Stern, what comes known as the Stern Gang, and Lehi, some of these people became experts in the brigade in infantry tactics, logistics, artillery, command structure. Some of the names you might recognize: Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Sadeh, Chaim Laskov, who later becomes the Ramatkal, the IDF chief of staff. Many battalion commanders, battalion and brigade commanders in 1948 were, so to speak, graduates of the Jewish brigade. The Jewish brigade, in one sense, was really the first modern Jewish national army in nearly 2,000 years. And I think we have to look at that with a sense of pride of what we, meaning they at the time, were able to accomplish, not only for that time period, not only to help the Jews to fight against the Nazis, not only to help the Jews post-World War II, but then to, I won't say seamlessly because it wasn't seamless, but eventually to merge into what will become eventually the IDF and cutting their teeth in the Jewish brigade. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to go backwards now. We have spent the last couple of months, at least, working on Zionism, the history of Zionism, and what I find over time when I teach is that people get to a point where there's just so much information and maybe it's disjointed, like, okay, how do all these pieces really fit together? So what I'm going to do is to spend tonight, the next few minutes, and then probably into next week, kind of just reviewing some of the information and putting it in a somewhat of a logical and chronological order. So the names, we're not repeating all the same information again, because that'd be boring and you guys can just check out right now. But I want to kind of just give an overview and mentioning again all the names, but putting it how they all worked together or didn't. One of the things that we have seen in the past many few weeks, is that Zionism did not emerge as a single idea or with a single voice. It emerged from conversations, it emerged from fights, it emerged from discussions and problems between rabbis and journalists, between maskilim and mystics, secular Jews, religious Jews, realists, non-religious, messianists. Everyone had a different voice and different opinion. There were those, as we mentioned, no, forget it. No Mashiach, no Israel. We don't need a country. We're staying right here in Russia. We prefer the pogroms of Ukraine, no problem. So it wasn't that like one day there's this idea of, okay, we're all going to Israel and we have Zionism. That's obviously it's not like that. Our main focus has been on the mid to late 18th century through the early 20th century, which is really the formative era of the Zionist movement and where the different categories of Zionism began. Again, if you look at the Knesset today, even if you look back about 25, 30 years ago, but still to this day, you can find the roots of some of the political parties in the early movements that were instrumental in the early days of Zionism. And if you want to do that homework, feel free. I'm not getting into that now until maybe one day when we talk about the Knesset. I want to retrace their personalities, their interactions, and step back with an overview or what's called a meta view of what Zionism actually was at its core and how we got to where we are now. If you ask the average person, average Jew who has some knowledge of Jewish history, and you ask him, when do you think Zionism began? Most will tell you with Herzl. And it's not, it exploded with Herzl. He was a catalyst, but it definitely did not start, sorry, with Herzl. The roots of Zionism really came by three different crises converging. Now, there's an expression in English, a perfect storm. A perfect storm can be a person has, God forbid, one day everything goes wrong for them. You know, they got up late, they missed the bus, they didn't get to work on time, they got fired, their spouse is upset with them, the children can't seem to get it, whatever it might be. Like at the end of the day, they got whatever. It's a perfect storm. But this is on a very national, global way, perfect storm. It's the collapse of traditional Jewish autonomy in Europe, the failure of emancipation, which was going to be this big deal for the Jews, the French, and later on the others. This emancipation was going to be fantastic for the Jews. It didn't deliver dignity. It didn't deliver safety. It didn't deliver emancipation. And the transformation of Jewish self-understanding from being more of like a religious, pious community to a historical nation that they had felt that they had to grow and to get away from this model that was imploding because of outside forces and in some cases inside forces. Even in the 18th century, late 18th century, late 1700s, Jews are already being forced to answer a question. Are we not necessarily that no one's was taking a survey, but in a general way of either it's introspection or discussion of are we merely a faith, a religion, or are we a people? I heard a wonderful comment. Where did I hear it? I think it was. I started listening. I started learning Orot. Finally, it's Rav Kook's writing. It's my understanding from the introduction the teacher was giving. To understand all of the other writings, you need to understand to read Orot because he explains his approach to life, to learning, to Torah, to everything there. And in there, he mentions about the Jews. He has, I think it was Rav Shirky who was explaining it like this, if I'm not mistaken. Just think, or was him, or was in Tanya? I'm listening to Igrot HaKodesh. I'll see if I remember who the source is. In either case, the question was, is Judaism a religion? And I think it was Rav Kook who said, again, I could be misquoting, Judaism is not a religion. What do you mean it's not a religion? Of course it's a religion. No, he says the religion is, when you take a look at the Catholics, Christians, Buddhists, any other religion, what does it do? They have a day where they may go to church. They have certain rituals they'll do for holidays. They may have certain things they will do depending on the time of year. But otherwise, during their day, it's their day. They're not doing anything proactively necessarily during the day. They may be living a religious life. I mean, a proper life and giving charity and all. But it's just that's the religion, and there's certain benchmarks during the year that they have to do. By Jews, it's from the morning we wake up to the morning we go to sleep. Our lives are structured through halacha, through Torah. That's not that. So again, the thing is, Rav Kook said that you try to make that distinction between a religion. Again, of course, Judaism is a religion in the world's eyes, but he's talking on a more of a hashkafic or a philosophical way. That religion, he determines, or he explains, is different things that one might do, whereas this is a lifestyle. Anyways, let's come back to here. So the question of, are we merely a faith, people of faith, or are we an actual people? This question had haunted the Haskalah movement. We talk about the Haskalah movement. It broke apart traditional authority and eventually produces very radical differences. Some said we are religion and nothing more. We're Jews. We're Torah observant Jews. We stay here. We follow Torah. Good enough for us. Others say we are a nation like other nations. Others say we are a nation because we are a covenantal people, meaning we're a kind of a mixture of both. We are a nation, and we have a common history. And that common history is Judaism. And that common history is Torah. And that common history brings us back to Sinai. And where did all of these ideas converge? They converge on the battlefield that becomes Zionism. And I say battlefield because in a sense it was a bit of a battlefield. I'm going to mention again about Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher and Shmuel Mahalever, some of what we talked about proto-Zionism, which is the pre-Zionistic official time period. And they approach it from the halachic perspective. Before Herzl, religious Zionism already existed. It didn't call itself that yet. That's what it was. Rav Kalisher was against the Talmud Chacham, rooted deeply in halacha. He argued that redemption would not come instead of human action, but because of human action, meaning get up, get off your butt, do something. He believed that the settlement of the land of the land of Israel was a halachic obligation, that the agricultural renewal of the country was part of the Geulah, or the redemption, and we had to act politically, we had to act economically, and prepare ourselves for the Geulah, for the redemption. It was, if I can use the term, active messianism. No, doesn't mean messianism, unfortunately, has gotten a bad name recently, as the last few years, but it meant the anticipation of the Geulah. It was grounded in Rambam, Ramban, Kuzari, Navi. It wasn't just these pulling out of thin air, this idea. It was radical because they rejected certain tradition. They didn't reject certain tradition, but what they did do is reinterpret the idea of being passive. The Jews for centuries were passive, and people felt that is the right thing to do. Just kind of keep your head down, and maybe they'll pass over us this time. But he felt that's a distortion of faith. You have to stand up. You have to take action. You have to take arms in your hands when necessary too. Shmuel Mahalever, similar idea. He is, as I mentioned weeks ago, a great bridge in Jewish history. He was a respected rabbinic authority. He founded Chovavei Zion, and he spoke both in the rabbinic world, in the religious world, and in the secular world. He was able to straddle both worlds. He insisted on three things. Zionism cannot uproot Torah. Now, we talk, and we'll see in a minute if we get to it. There was a secular Zionism. Torah had no point or place in that form of Zionism. He said, no. You can't have Zionism without Torah. You can't get rid of Torah. You don't have Zionism then. And secondly, Torah cannot fear Jewish sovereignty. There's nothing wrong with the Jews taking the land that's theirs and running their own country, and that the settlement movement had to be practical, had to be agricultural, had to be disciplined. And he is the one who really defended, on a halachic basis, early secular settlers. And the settlers is not the kind we're talking about today. Today, the settler movement, and I hate that term, I really do, but that's only my perspective. I say I have the I've seen people with a T-shirt. I'm an obstacle to peace. The word settler and settler violence and all that, that's a terrible, terrible rap in the world. I'm not talking about settler violence, just settlers. But in any case, he felt that it was, again, similar to Reines and others, that you're fulfilling a mitzvah of historic proportion. Okay, so I think what I'm going to stop here because the next chunk will take me a little longer. I'm going to continue next week. We'll talk about Chovei Zion. We'll talk about Herzl, kind of how to wrap this time period up. And then we're going to go to pre-World War I, look at the political movements, what was happening, what led to World War I, what the Jews' involvement were, etc. Because after all, this is a Jewish history class. And then we'll move on from there. Meantime, let's hope for some Berosot Tovot. If you are a news junkie, like unfortunately I am, you have like 500 different opinions of what's coming, what's not coming, when it's not coming. Just main thing is we fall to our emunah. Whatever's going to be, whether it's going to be United States attacking, Israel and United States, Iran striking first, whoever it is, the Mishnah said we only have Hashem to rely on. He gives us all the munitions, he gives us friends, he gives us help, Hashem, but it's ultimately Hashem running the show. So we have to work on that. Have a great evening, everybody.